Well, hi everyone, and welcome to McLean Church. My name is Amy, and I am a part of our McLean Kids team. Whether you're joining us online, by radio, or on YouTube, we are so glad that you've decided to join us. Today we want to let you know about McLean Church Anywhere. McLean Church Anywhere is a new way to gather for worship. Anyone can now host a worship experience anywhere from a laptop or phone using our website or the McLean Church app. We update the content every week to keep you current with our weekly gatherings, no matter where you are. We want to share the value of this tool with you, and we are hosting a brief training that you can attend from the comfort of your home at 7 p.m. on Monday, April 19th. McLean Church Anywhere includes all of the elements of our worship gatherings in one place, including sermon audio and video, announcements, prayers, worship songs, and discussion questions. Use all of it, or just the components that are right for your gathering. Register today on our website, and your confirmation email will include the Zoom link and the passcode needed to attend the training. Well, that's what's happening here at McLean. Let's join together in song.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for McLean Church Online. My name is Steve, and Colossians 3:2 says, "Think about the things of heaven, not of things of earth." In many ways, the crucifixion was noted as foolish and reckless in the eyes of the world. 1 Corinthians 1:18 says, "The message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction, but we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. As the scriptures say, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and discard the intelligence of the intelligent." God counts the cost of his love and still pursues us anyway. It further says in verse 25, "This foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength." So as we sing, we are not saying that God himself is reckless, but to us, the way he loves, in many regards, is quite so. For I spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. For I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God, yeah. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. No wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. No shadow
We are so thankful for your generous support at McLean Church and our goal to impact our region for Jesus Christ. We've made it simple for you to give online through our McLean Church app. Just tap the Give button. Or by text, simply text the word McLean to 77977. That's the word McLean, MCLANE, to 77977, and we'll guide you from there. Thank you again for your continued generosity.
Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. No matter where or when or how you're participating in this service, we're really glad you're with us this week. Next week, we'll resume our study of the Old Testament book of Leviticus. This week, though, we thought it would be helpful to answer a question we've gotten a lot over the past year, which is, when are we going back? When are we going to get back to normal around here? And the simple answer to that question is, we're not. Now, I realize that declaration needs some explanation and development, and admittedly, I'm partially using the statement for its shock value. But the truth is, we are not going back, we're going forward. And I deeply value you thinking with me about that today. Listen again to the account of the resurrection that we read last week in our Easter celebration. This is from Mark's Gospel, the 16th chapter. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome, brought spices so that they might go anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Note especially in this account the statement, "He is going ahead of you into Galilee." The resurrected Jesus is going ahead of the disciples into a new day, a new reality. He's not going back to Jerusalem, he's going ahead to Galilee. Jesus made it clear that the work of God in the world would always be moving forward with new chapters, new models, and new paradigms. There would always be resurrection. There would always be a new day. Holding on to what was would prevent the experience of what could be. Jesus Christ is still going ahead of His church. He's going ahead of us, and it's time for us to follow. We're not going back, we're moving forward. And today, as we think about that truth, I'd like us to consider 5 things. First, I'd like us to think about the changing nature of the church. Secondly, I'd like us to think about what Jesus started. Thirdly, I'd like us to talk or think about the changing realities of our culture. Fourth, I'd like us to think about a new model for a new day. And finally, I'd like us to think about how we're going to give people access to Christ. Now, fair warning, this is a bit long, so wherever you're viewing this talk, get comfortable. We're going to be here for a while, but I think our thoughtfulness around these issues will be well worth our investment of time. So let's begin by talking about the changing nature of the church. It's the tendency of all of us to think that whatever we grew up experiencing is the way things always are, or at least the way things always should be. I was the youngest of 3 children, and by the time my parents got to raising me, perhaps they'd relaxed some of their rules a bit. But whatever the case, as a child, I didn't have to ask to get something to eat or drink out of the refrigerator. I had full access to whatever was in the refrigerator whenever I wanted. Imagine my shock to discover when playing at a friend's house one day that he had to actually ask his parents before he got something to eat or drink out of the refrigerator. I couldn't believe this. What kind of oppressive parental regime was he being reared under? Now, whether you think kids should have free access to the refrigerator or not is not the point. I'm sure a compelling case could be made for both approaches. The point is, we think the way we've always experienced things is the only way things can or should be done until we encounter or experience something different. This is no more true than it is in our experience and understanding of the church. For those of us who grew up attending church, all of us experienced a rather similar model. To be sure, there were differences in format, worship style, vocabulary, and content. For Protestants, it was a service. For Catholics, it was a mass. Episcopalians followed a liturgy, while Pentecostals were more free-flowing. Presbyterians said the Lord's Prayer, while Baptists rarely did. You get the idea. But still, at the core, what most of us experienced as church in America was relatively similar. Consider these 6 similarities. Number 1, for most of us, church was identified with a particular building, one that looked like a church. 2, the main thing, the big thing that the church did each week was a worship service or mass or Eucharistic celebration. The name and format may have been different, but the concept was the same. 3, this service was almost always on Sunday mornings, usually at 11 o'clock. 4, the service had 2 or 3 main components. Worship, which consisted of music, prayers, and perhaps a liturgical response. Preaching, sometimes called a homily. And third, depending on your particular tradition, the celebration of the Eucharist or communion or the Lord's Supper. Again, while the components may have looked differently, they were all essentially the same. Fifthly, all of this was packaged together to take place in the time frame of about an hour. Now, progressive churches often started 15 minutes early to be able to beat the noon crowd at local restaurants. And 6th, good Christians were expected to attend this big service or gathering every week because this was the primary thing the church did. And this model served our culture very well for arguably almost 3 centuries. But this is not the only model the church has ever followed. For instance, it's likely that the earliest followers of Jesus had no special gatherings to practice their new faith in Jesus. Being primarily Jewish, Jesus' earliest followers would have continued to meet in Jewish synagogues for the continued purpose of studying the Old Testament and likely talking about how the teachings of Jesus informed their understanding of the Old Testament texts. It's likely that there were initially no separate Christian worship gathering. Christianity was birthed in the forms and models of ancient Judaism. As Jesus' teachings began to spread among non-Jewish people, We do have evidence of followers of Jesus beginning to meet together in each other's homes, primarily for the purpose of celebrating the Lord's Supper, a full-scale meal where people would eat and visit and remember the death of Jesus. And we have some evidence that these gatherings took place on different days of the week, although as time passed, special significance began to be attached to Sunday, the first day of the week, as the day of Jesus' resurrection. Interestingly, during times of sporadic persecution in the early history of the church, we know that Christians gathered together in the catacombs, tombs, or think modern-day cemeteries, to avoid detection by the Roman authorities. And it's not until the 4th century, 300 years after Jesus, that church buildings begin to appear. Before that time, the only thing the word church referred to was a group of people or a religious sect, not a building. In many churches, for the next 1,000 years, you wouldn't hear anything like the 30 to 40-minute sermon such as the one you're listening to today. In fact, it's not really until the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, 1,500 years after Jesus, that the sermon begins to take center stage in many church services, a practice that continues to this day in churches like ours, where the sermon consumes at least 50% of our 60-minute allotment for worship. And while over the course of history there have been large gatherings of Christians for worship, such as the crowds that have historically gathered for worship at the Vatican, or perhaps the thousands who came to hear Charles Haddon Spurgeon speak in 19th century England, the concept of a megachurch with hundreds or thousands of people gathered for weekend worship is a model that dates back only about 50 years. And the multi-site model of ministry that we currently employ as a church is not even as old as that. And yet for most of us, when we think about church, we think about three things. We think about a 1-hour worship service conducted on Sunday morning, held in a church building, consisting of 50% music, 50% preaching, and perhaps the celebration of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. Or, to put it more simply, we think of 4 songs, a sermon, and communion. This is what church has been for us, and it's worked well. But again, this is not what church has always been. The church has taken on multiple different forms and models during its 2,000-year history, and these forms, at their best, have been determined and created by an honest reflection on this question: what will most effectively give our culture access to Jesus and the movement He embodied? In the early 1st century, gathering in the Jewish synagogue did that. In the Middle Ages, the absence of an in-depth sermon, but the presence of detailed paintings that told the story of Jesus worked. In 19th century America, tent revivals communicated the message of Jesus effectively. And in the second half of the 20th century in America, large gatherings of people on a weekend for high-energy, technologically driven experiences of worship that use contemporary styles of music and preaching, they have done much to present the teaching of Jesus to the prevailing culture. Different forms, different models, all with one goal: to give people access to Jesus Christ and the way of life He taught. The church has always been and always will be changing. The church we grew up with is not the only church that has ever been. And this changing nature of the church, it's essential, because Jesus did not start an institution, He started a movement, which is the second big idea I'd like us to think about today. Jesus started, or really continued and expanded on, a movement to transform the world. Really, world transformation. The plan Jesus promoted, which was the plan of God from the beginning of time, was the transformation of the world one life and one heart at a time. Jesus was just crazy enough to believe and teach that the world could become a better place if His followers would simply love the people around them. Acting lovingly toward other people would begin to heal hurts and wounds and divisions and heartaches, and it would produce a response of love in the person being loved. This in turn would cause that person to begin to act lovingly toward the people around them, and while you see how it works, love becomes transformable, contagious, and transferable. The world in Jesus' mind could be changed one person at a time through the power of love, which was God's plan from the start. Jesus' followers were commissioned by Him to advance this movement, which He referred to as the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, this realm in which God's rule of love would reign. And that is what the early followers of Jesus did. And the plan worked. The movement caught on. The movement began to grow. So by the end of the first century, this message of Jesus, summarized in the mantra, love God and love your neighbor, has spread throughout the Roman Empire. The empire was being changed one life at a time through the power of love. This really happened. Historians and sociologists have long noted that it was the loving acts of the Christian community that made this movement so attractive and so explosive. Imagine that. Now, as always happens, as the Jesus movement grew, it became more and more institutionalized. All movements have to experience some form of institutionalization for the movement to survive. This is normal and it's necessary. So by the end of the first century, there's a growing institutionalizing of the church. You begin to see this in some of the later writings of the New Testament. The problem, however, when movements become institutionalized, is that sometimes the institution takes over the movement. People who were once passionate about the movement become protectors of the institution. This happens, I think, with all movements, and it has clearly happened many times in the 2,000-year history of the church. To maintain a healthy movement, the institution, the forms, models, practices must serve the mission of the movement. This, of necessity, requires the institution to repeatedly change. Because one thing we know from history is that the forms, models, and practices that work in one time setting and culture will not necessarily work in another time, setting, or culture. Consider this example. In the American church of the last 2 centuries, the primary time for weekly worship was Sunday morning. When American missionaries went to Brazil and started churches there, they started churches that held worship services on Sunday morning, just like was done in the United States. Now here was the problem, and I've witnessed this firsthand. Mornings do not work in Brazil. For one thing, it gets very hot very quickly. So by the time of an 11 o'clock worship service on Sunday morning, the temperature and humidity in some regions of Brazil are unbearable. And secondly, Brazilian culture is largely, it's a nightlife culture. Social gatherings happen primarily at night. So guess what? Sunday morning worship services didn't work in Brazil like they worked in the United States. But when some Brazilian churches changed their primary worship time from Sunday morning to Sunday night after the sun went down, it worked incredibly well. The form, model, and practices were different, but the movement was still the same. Now, much of what we identify as Christianity or faith in Jesus Christ or church is really none of those things. It is instead a description of the institution that we have created to serve the movement. Unfortunately, all too often, the movement ends up serving the institution. And when this happens, the movement loses its power. Jesus' movement, changing the world one life at a time through the power of love, requires an ever-changing institution to effectively impact an ever-changing culture. The church has always been at its best and most effective when it has recognized this. And we are living in an ever-changing culture. The culture the church functions in today is radically different from the culture of 50 years ago, when churches like ours, often referred to as attractional churches, began to emerge. And it's different from even the culture of 10 years ago, when churches like ours began to pursue a multi-site model or strategy. Culture has always been changing, but today it is seemingly changing faster than ever before. Events like this year's pandemic have only accelerated this process of change. So as the third big point that we want to consider today, let's think about a few of the changes that have happened in the last 30 years. Let's go back to 1991, the year I started my job as pastor of McLean Church. In 1991, Sundays were still sacred, whether you attended church or not. Sundays were still considered a set-aside day. Limited activities were scheduled on that day. Sunday mornings were largely open in people's calendars. And the justification that I can't do that because I have to go to church on Sunday morning, it was considered a legitimate and accepted excuse. Today, none of these things is really the case. Sunday is just another day among the seven. Consider a second thing. In 1991, people were moved by big crowds and big gatherings, especially when it related to the church. Billy Graham crusades still drew crowds. A church that could boast 200 or more in a worship service was considered a big deal. People were euphoric about combined worship gatherings or special events that would draw a crowd. The feeling was bigger is better, and big things drew people. Not so much anymore. In 1991, highly produced, professional appearing worship services attracted people to church. This was largely because churches had become known for poor quality productions that seemed to celebrate mediocrity. The more produced and refined the worship experience could be made, the better. A year ago, interestingly, I recorded a video for another large church, and the only real parameters that they set on the video was to make sure it wasn't too highly produced, to make sure it was not too perfect. It's a different culture. In 1991, the majority of people in American culture still had some familiarity with church culture and Christian faith, primarily because they had some experience with church and Christian faith in their childhood. This is no longer the case. While I don't have factual statistics, it seems like a sizable number of people in our present-day American culture have had no experience or exposure to church and Christian faith. So things that many of us simply assumed growing up, like good people go to church every Sunday morning, it's not assumed by our culture any longer. In 1991, most people were influenced by a Cartesian style of learning or an Enlightenment mindset that championed rational thinking or dualistic processing. Things were either right or wrong, yes or no, good or bad. There was no middle ground. Today's culture is moving further and further away from this either-or approach to life. And in 1991, choices were limited. While this was beginning to rapidly change, we did not yet live in the culture of choice that exists today. 24/7 was not yet a thing, at least not in northwestern Pennsylvania. And think about this. You know how today when you need something for your home and Lowe's doesn't have it, so you just go to Home Depot or vice versa? Well, in 1991, neither Lowe's or Home Depot existed in northwestern Pennsylvania. If a local lumber or hardware store didn't have it, you went without. You also walked to school uphill both ways. In 1991, there was no popularly available or accessible internet. No cell phones, really. No Facebook, no TikTok, no Twitter. Think about all of that. When you wanted to deposit a check, you actually went to the bank to do that. And I do realize some of us are saying, is there any other way? Now, here's the thing. There's always the tendency to evaluate cultural changes as either good or bad. For instance, 24/7 availability of essential services is good. The loss of Sunday as a sacred day is bad. I want to propose that this is not the best way to look at cultural change, at least not from the perspective of the church. Now, while many would disagree with me on this, I think the church's time and energy is much better spent figuring out how to advance what Jesus taught amidst the cultural changes than standing in vocal opposition or protest to those changes. Because here's the truth. Much of cultural change is neither good or bad. It just is. Whether people prefer highly produced worship experiences to more natural and unrefined ones doesn't seem to me to be a moral issue. And where cultural change does have a moral or ethical implication to it, my vocal critique of it probably is not going to change it. Isn't the movement Jesus started much better served by effectively offering an alternative to the prevailing culture's mindset rather than simply griping and moaning about what our culture has become? Please think about that with me for a moment. To a changing culture, the church must offer a new model. Culture is not the same as it was 30 years ago, and the model of the church cannot be the same as it was 30 years ago. That is, if the institution of the church is going to continue to serve the movement Jesus advanced. The church must offer a new model for a new day. I think that may be the most important statement we'll make in this talk, so let me say it once again. To a changing culture, the church must offer a new model. Culture is not the same as it was 30 years ago, and the model of the church cannot be the same as it was 30 years ago. That is, if the institution of the church is going to continue to serve the movement Jesus advanced. The church must offer a new model for a new day. And this is the next big thing I'd like us to talk about, recognizing that the challenge is we don't exactly know what this new model should look like. But it is becoming a bit clearer every day. For the past 10 years, churches like ours have noticed a consistent trend, a decline in attendance at weekend worship services. While there have certainly been exceptions to this trend, the trend has been thoroughly documented enough to factually state that people do not attend churches like ours the way they did 10 years ago. And the trend is true in churches like ours that have enjoyed phenomenal stretches of growth over the past 30 years. As you've heard us say many times, for the past 3 years, we've been asking some very tough questions about this trend and the future model of ministry that will be required to reach and continue to reach our ever-changing culture. Well before this pandemic, we were beginning to conclude that bringing large numbers of people together at one place at one time on the weekend for a highly produced worship experience was no longer going to be the only or even the most effective way to transform our culture. We were very much sensing that the institution of the church was once again going to have to change if the person and teachings of Jesus were going to be made accessible to our changing culture. The pandemic, which created a period of time when we could not bring together a large number of people in one place at one time, it just accelerated our thinking. So for the better part of 3 years, and with great intensity over this past year, we've been asking the question, what does work in this new day? What is working in this culture to give people access to Christ? And the answer is lots of things. This is an incredibly exciting time for the church. For anyone who looks at the last year and thinks this has been a bad time for the church, you are not seeing reality clearly. The church has thrived over the past 12 months in many, many ways. In fact, the message of the church has never been as accessible as it has been over the past 12 months. Far from being shut down or closed, we have been moving into areas never before imagined and reaching people never before noticed through the many different things we've been able to do this past year. And we're just getting started. It seems in this new day, lots of different things are working to connect people to the life of the church and to the movement of Jesus. Let me share just a few things that we know are working. Number one, we know that smaller gatherings, whether it's a life group using our McLean Anywhere resource or events like Grief Share, small gatherings are connecting people in meaningful ways and allowing them to engage with the teachings of Jesus. 2, online experiences. Whether that's the weekly worship service online or Zoom meetings for small groups, the online world is opening up connections to people who, for a multitude of reasons, were never going to be able to access an in-person experience. It would seem, at least for the foreseeable future, that online experiences are here to stay. Thirdly, non-weekend gatherings are working. Things like the Immerse Book Club group on Monday nights or our Erie congregation's First Wednesdays. Non-weekend events are making the community of the church and the teaching of Jesus available to an increasing number of people. Service-driven events are working. Would God prefer us more to worship or to serve? Or when done in Jesus' name, are they really one and the same? More and more, we're seeing what Jesus clearly taught. Service is as transformational as worship. In fact, maybe even more so. So beginning this month, for instance, our Union City congregation will be taking one Sunday a month to gather not for a worship service, but to gather to serve. Way to lead the way, Union City. Fifthly, we know that in-person weekend worship events, yes, they are still working. In-person services, like we've been doing here for 30 years, they still work. Many of us find our primary connection point to the teaching of Jesus and to the life of the church to be the in-person weekend worship experience, which is why this past year has been so hard. The traditional weekend worship service, it still works to give people access to Christ. It's just not the only thing that works, or even the primary thing that works in this new day. Think of it like this. For the past 30 years, the main thing we've done as a church is the weekend worship service. Now, we've done a couple of other things, namely small groups and generational ministry, but even those events have been secondary to the weekend worship experience. We rightly put all our energy into getting people here for the weekend. If people could just experience a weekend worship service the way we put that experience on, we believed barriers would be eliminated and people would have access to Christ. And it worked. But it no longer works like it once did. It still works for some people and will continue to work for some people. But it's not the only thing that works. So rather than think in terms of one big thing, like the church has done for the past 30 years, what if we thought in terms of multiple things, all considered equal in their ability to connect people to the community of the church and to convey the teachings of Jesus? What if we thought in terms of not just one event or offering, but in terms of multiple events and offerings? What if we really believed it didn't matter if you attended a small group using McLean Anywhere, or participated in something like Grief Share, or attended an in-person worship experience? All of these things had equal ability to connect you to the community of the church and the teachings of Jesus. And what if we made sure we structured and organized those events to do just that? What if we could envision a church where one member would say, my primary connection to McLean Church is online. And another member would say, my primary connection is the student gathering in Union City on Thursday afternoons. And another said, it's serving in the kitchen each week with McLean Meals that's my primary point of connection. And another said, it's a 9 a.m. in-person worship service in Edinburgh that is my main point of connection to the community of the church and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Could we envision that kind of church? A church that didn't just have one door, but many doors. A church that gave people access to Christ, not just in one way, but in multiple ways. I get excited about envisioning that kind of church as long as I stay focused on the movement, not the institution. And that's a hard thing to do, because here's the deal. Success in the church world is still measured by how many people you have attending your 11 o'clock Sunday morning worship service. But I'm convinced this number is no longer an accurate measure of success. Numbers will still matter, but it will no longer be the number of people sitting in your seats for a weekend worship experience that tell the story. It will be the number of people the church is connecting with on a weekly basis in many different forms and formats, and engaging them in community and conveying to them the teachings of Jesus. This past week, we evaluated the connection points we've developed as a church over the past year, assessing their effectiveness to determine which should continue as we move into the summer. You might be surprised to know that we identified over 15 different connection points in addition to our in-person worship services that were providing access for people to the life of the church and the teachings of Jesus. Now, for a church whose mission is to eliminate barriers to give people access to Christ, this was incredibly encouraging. We're moving forward, and we're going to continue to do so. And the risen Christ, who went ahead of his followers into Galilee, is leading the way. Now, this is a lot, I know, and there is so much more that could be said. But let's wrap this up for now with these final few thoughts. The church, at its best, has always willingly changed the institution to advance the movement. We are experiencing the greatest cultural changes that many of us have ever experienced in our lifetimes, which means a new model that focuses not on one singular access point, but on many, is needed to effectively help our culture access Jesus Christ. This new model, it may require us to give up some of the things we hold most dear in order to give other people access to the Christ we love. And that is a sacrifice that we have always and always will gladly make. Let me close with a story about the kind of person I always want to be. In 1991, we set out to change the model of McLean Church, to transition the church from what was then considered traditional to what would come to be called contemporary. One day, we got the bright idea to remove the choir loft in the old church building and set up a drum set, my drum set, in its place. I would lead worship while playing the drums, joined by a guitar and keyboard player. What is standard fare for us now was revolutionary then. The change prompted many people to begin attending or resume attending the church. One day, when leaving the platform after preaching, an older member of the church grabbed me by the arm and said, "It is really hard for me to see those drums on that stage." As a 25-year-old young pastor, I began to melt. Then this member, whose life had been spent building the church that was, said this: "But if that is what we need to do to reach people, that's what we need to do." For the literally thousands of people whose lives have been touched and changed by McLean Church in the last 30 years, it is that member and others like her who deserve all the credit. And I purposed on that day that I always wanted to be that kind of church member. And I hope you do too. Now is the time for us to make a difference. Now is the moment. So no, we're not going back to what was. We're moving forward. And it's going to be an amazing ride. I surely hope you will join us for it.
We want to thank you for joining us today and remind you to check out all that we have to offer you and your family. Visit our website at mcleanchurch.org for more information and check out our YouTube channel for both past and current worship experiences. Now, as you go into the week, may God bless you and keep you. Amen.